You hear that hosting the World Cup brings massive economic benefits to a country. Stay with me, because the reality is far less obvious than it sounds. The United States will host the 2026 World Cup, but the question feels strange. Does a country actually profit from an event like this? Or does it just look like profit on the surface? Because when money moves at this scale, it rarely flows where people expect. You see packed stadiums, global attention, and billions in spending. It feels like a guaranteed economic win. But that feeling comes from visibility, not from actual distribution. Most people assume more spending automatically means more national profit. But spending and profit are not the same thing. They depend on who receives the money and who pays the costs. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because the World Cup is not just a sports event. It is a complex financial system operating across multiple layers. The first layer is what everyone sees. Tourists arrive, hotels fill, restaurants get busy, flights increase. Money appears to flow into the country quickly. This creates the impression of economic growth. But that is only the surface layer, because beneath that, there is a second layer most people ignore. The cost of making the event possible in the first place. Security, logistics, infrastructure, coordination, all require massive spending. And much of that spending is not optional. It is required just to host the event safely and successfully. Now here is where the contradiction appears. The country spends billions to host the event, but it does not directly collect most of the revenue. That revenue flows somewhere else. And that is the part rarely explained clearly. Because the system is designed so the visible winner is not always the real winner. So before asking if the United States profits, you need to ask a different question. Who actually captures the value created by the World Cup? Because once you see that clearly, the idea of profit starts to look very different. Not wrong, but incomplete. And that is where the real story begins. Because the next layer is not about countries. It is about organizations that operate above them. And their incentives are very different. Once you see that layer, the entire structure starts making more sense. And also becomes slightly uncomfortable, because it explains why the same pattern repeats across countries, even when the financial outcome is not always positive. And that pattern is what we are about to break down next. Because once you see it, you will never look at global events the same way again. Not as celebrations, but as systems with very specific flows. At the center of this system is an organization most people rarely question. FIFA controls the tournament, but more importantly, it controls the revenue streams. Broadcast rights alone generate billions from global networks. Then come sponsorships from multinational brands seeking global exposure. And finally, ticket sales, licensing, and merchandising revenues. Most of this income does not belong to the host country. It flows directly to FIFA and its commercial ecosystem. This is where the first illusion begins to break. The biggest revenue pool is not controlled by the country hosting the event. Now compare that with who absorbs the operational burden. Local governments handle security, policing, and public safety infrastructure. Cities manage transportation systems under extreme temporary demand, and public resources are redirected toward the event's success. These costs are real, immediate, and often publicly funded. So the financial structure starts to look asymmetrical. Revenue concentrates globally, while costs remain local. Now here is where it becomes more subtle. The benefits that countries highlight are often indirect. Tourism increases, but only for a limited window of time. Local businesses see spikes, but not always sustained growth. And long-term economic impact is difficult to measure clearly. This creates a narrative gap between perception and reality. People remember the excitement, not the accounting. And that makes the event feel more profitable than it may actually be. This is not deception, but it is selective visibility. You see inflows clearly, but outflows are more diffuse. Now consider the United States specifically. It already has stadiums, infrastructure, and commercial capacity, so its cost structure is lower than many previous hosts. This reduces financial risk compared to building everything from scratch, but it does not change the underlying system. The same revenue distribution still applies, which means the core question remains unchanged. Who captures the largest share of value? And who absorbs the most uncertainty? Because profit is not just about totals. It is about distribution and risk. Now here is the behavioral layer behind all of this. Countries compete to host events, even when returns are unclear, because visibility, prestige, and global positioning feel valuable. And those benefits are difficult to quantify in strict financial terms. So decisions are not purely economic. They're partly psychological and strategic. If this is changing how you see global events, stay with this, because the next layer explains who actually benefits on the ground, and why that benefit does not always reach everyone equally. This is where the story becomes more personal, because it moves from institutions into everyday economic reality. And that is where the impact becomes much easier to feel, even if it is rarely explained in this way. On the ground, the benefits of the World Cup do not spread evenly. Some sectors gain significantly, while others barely feel any change. Hotels, airlines, and major service providers see immediate demand increases. Prices rise quickly because demand is concentrated into a short period, so revenue spikes, but only for those positioned to capture it. Small local businesses may benefit, but not always in a consistent way. Some are crowded out by larger chains with better infrastructure. Others face higher costs without proportional increases in income. This creates uneven distribution even within the same city. Now consider residents living in host locations. They experience increased prices, congestion, and temporary disruption. Housing costs can rise due to short-term rental demand. Daily life becomes more expensive during the event window, but their income does not necessarily increase to match that pressure. So from their perspective, the event can feel costly rather than profitable. This is another layer of the same pattern. Benefits concentrate, while costs diffuse across a wider population. And diffuse costs are harder to notice collectively, because no single person feels the full impact clearly. Now here's the part that often gets overlooked entirely. Temporary economic activity does not always create permanent value. Once the event ends, demand returns closer to normal levels. So the spike in activity does not necessarily translate into long-term growth. This is called the substitution effect in economic behavior. People spend more during the event, but may spend less afterward, which reduces the net impact over a longer time horizon. So the visible surge does not always equal lasting gain. Now step back and look at the full structure. Global organizations capture large, centralized revenue streams. Large corporations capture concentrated local demand. And the general population absorbs smaller, distributed costs. Each layer experiences a different version of the same event, which is why opinions about profitability vary so widely. Now we move into the final layer, because this is not just about the World Cup itself. It is about how large systems distribute value more generally. And once you see that pattern, you start recognizing it in many other areas of the economy. Not just sports, but infrastructure, tech platforms, and global trade, because the structure repeats more often than it appears. And understanding that structure changes how you interpret growth. It stops being about total numbers and becomes about distribution, incentives, and timing. That shift is subtle, but extremely important, because it replaces surface-level thinking with deeper clarity. And that clarity is what we bring together in the final section, where the answer becomes less about profit and more about understanding how the system actually works. Because once you understand the system, the question itself starts to change. By now, the question is no longer simply whether the United States profits. It becomes a deeper question about how value is distributed across the system. The World Cup generates enormous economic activity. That part is real. But activity is not the same as retained value. Value moves through layers, and each layer captures a different portion. At the top, global organizations capture concentrated, high-margin revenue streams. In the middle, corporations capture demand spikes tied to the event. At the base, the general public absorbs smaller, distributed costs. So the answer depends on where you are inside that structure. From one perspective, it looks like growth and opportunity. From another, it looks like pressure and redistribution. Both are true at the same time. And that is why the question feels confusing, because it does not have a single, clean answer. Now here is the part that usually brings clarity. The United States is less likely to lose heavily compared to other hosts, because it already has infrastructure, stadiums, and commercial systems in place. So its cost base is lower, and its private sector is stronger. But that does not mean the country captures most of the upside. It simply means the risk is more controlled, which is very different from guaranteed profit. Now step back and look at the bigger pattern. Large global events are rarely about simple financial gain. They are about positioning, influence, and long-term perception. And those benefits are harder to measure, but still very real. So countries participate even when the math is not perfectly clear, because the system rewards visibility as much as profitability. If this felt confusing before, that is completely normal, because most explanations focus only on surface-level numbers and ignore how value actually flows beneath them. But once you see the structure, the confusion starts to fade. You stop asking whether it is simply profit or loss, and start asking who benefits and who carries the cost. That shift changes how you interpret not just this event, but many large systems that look similar on the surface. If this helped you see something more clearly, stay with this channel. There is always another layer behind how money actually moves, and most of it is rarely explained in simple terms. So take a moment and reflect on this pattern. Where else have you seen growth that did not feel evenly distributed? That question alone reveals more than most headlines ever will, because awareness is what turns complex systems into understandable ones. And understanding is where better decisions begin. Not louder, not faster, but more precise over time. You are not missing something obvious. You are simply seeing deeper than the surface now. And that perspective is already a form of advantage, because it changes how you interpret future opportunities, not as simple wins, but as systems with trade-offs. And that awareness is what protects you from misunderstanding value.